Get ready to listen, learn, and earn CE hours. This podcast features content from an accredited CE activity provided by Colibri Healthcare. Visit elitelearning.com/podcasts for accreditation and disclosure statements and instructions on how you may be able to earn CE credits.
Hello and welcome. I'm Leanna McGuire, your host for this informative podcast on managing foodborne illness, brought to you by Elite Learning by Colibri Healthcare. Our subject matter expert today is Kirk Ornstein. He's RN, MSN, and clinical nurse leader, and a guy who's obviously really good at research. Welcome, Kirk. How are you?
Thank you. Good. It's good to be here.
Good to have you here. Now, obviously, foodborne illness is pretty self-explanatory, but we want to know as much about it as we can. So what's the history of foodborne illness, or how far back might the first case have been?
Well, it's an interesting question. Documentation, historical diaries have suggest that the first case was with Alexander the Great in 323 BC.
Wow.
It's believed that he died from typhoid fever, which is part of the Salmonella family. You might wonder why we know that. There were royal diaries, and at the time, typhoid fever was rampant in that society. So that's looked at being sort of the first case that they can document.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. That is amazing. And what else can you tell us related to history?
Well, one of the first food laws was the size of bread, which was basically the law of bread that was instituted by King John of England in 1202. Basically, they didn't want anything added to the bread like peas or beans. Don't really know why, but that was one of the first laws about that. And that sort of progressed through different environments, where in the United States, in 1785, Massachusetts passed a law similar to that, basically saying that acts against selling unwholesome provisions was illegal. It's considered the first law in the United States, but it was meant to create an ability to punish people who basically sold bad produce.
Okay.
Yeah.
And unwholesome, I mean, you'd have to determine unwholesome. So I'm sure that was quite the process from there. What was the next step in that?
Well, we sort of get to the early 20th century. And in 1906, they passed the Pure Food Drug Act and the Federal Meal Inspection Act. But what's interesting about that is that really came about because of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. I don't know if anyone's read that. I don't know if it's required reading anymore. But basically, it was a fictionalized book about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And it describes the very unhygienic, dangerous environment that meat processing was undergoing. And through that publication, it brought awareness about this industry.
Wow.
And that spurred the development of these laws. These laws were already in Congress at the time, but they couldn't get passed. Industry didn't want them. Congress didn't really push it. But when this became public, those laws were able to be passed.
Wow, I mean, really, 1906 is a long time from 323 BC, the first case that we're aware of. So obviously, and sadly, I'm sure a lot of people were lost in the time frame in between with this process. But that's really interesting about the meat packing. So, what other changes came about related to that? Would they just pass the law, but What happened with that law?
Yeah, well, at that time there was a lot of sort of technological advances going on. What maybe seemed very benign and simple to us now were brand new technologies, and one of those was canning. Obviously, canning was a way to preserve fruits and vegetables and transport them around the country to different communities, and that wasn't available at the time. Everyone had their local produce, their own farms. Um, but this came out of the Civil War, where obviously they had to transport food around, and canning was utilized then. So around 1919, canning industry was really trying to push this as a viable source for communities um, to store food. But like most communities, new technology is makes people uncomfortable.
Right.
And so we see that now. And so the idea of canning wasn't accepted the way that the canning industry had hoped. Um, and at that time, there was a botulism outbreak between 1919 and 1920 that killed 18 people across the country.
Wow.
And just like media, they picked it up, they ran with it. It became a national sensation. And all of a sudden, everyone was anti canning. Um, and so at the time, they tracked this back to uh, canned olives in California, black olives in California. And as this got back to these canning industries, they realized that they were at a point where this could go very badly for them in the industry because the backlash was huge. And so they put together their own research group to look into how to prevent this. And they actually did the research, came up with regulations on how to make canning safer. And they actually joined with the California Health Department and allowed them to oversee this process. And so it enabled them to have legitimacy behind what they were trying to do, but it also created a situation where now the industry was partnering with government agencies. And that was sort of the start of what we see today between the CDC, the FDA, USDA, and industry. And so that became sort of the first real regulatory kind of process. And by 1925, this had expanded out to many, many other foods and products.
It's really interesting that you bring that up because as soon as you started talking about the canning, I was thinking, oh, there had to be people that thought there's no way that we're going to go with this. And it's interesting that when the government got involved, there was more trust. That doesn't, things have changed a little since then. I would
Yeah.
say just because that trust level was, they're always going to do the right thing for us. So that's an interesting transition. So
I think
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the things I sort of love about this story is because it still resonates today. When you see a dented can in the supermarket, everyone's like, botulism, botulism. And, it's one of these ancient stories, but somehow it still resonates today.
Yeah.
And there's some truth to it. But the reality is that even a dented can is okay. You're looking for very specific signs. If it's dented along seams, it's bad, or if it looks like it's expanding with something, it's bad. But
Right.
little dents are okay.
Good to know. Thank you for that. So they have very strict regulations now for botulism, which of course is not the only foodborne illness. And I know that we're going to get into that in greater detail. But talk to me about outbreak investigation.
All right.
How was that?
So it starts at the base or local level with doctors who will diagnose these conditions. And if they are one of these reportable ones, such as botulism or E. coli or that nature, it is then reported to the CDC. That happens through the National Outbreak Reporting System. And then it goes to CDC. That information will then be fed into a system called PulseNet, which basically is a storage database of DNA fingerprints of pathogens or foodborne pathogens. And so they'll match it or put it into this database and see if they get basically a match, meaning there's another case like this somewhere else. If it doesn't have a match and it's just one case from one local place, the CDC doesn't get involved. But if they find that there are cases in different states, then to the CDC, that becomes an outbreak that they investigate. If that's not the case, then the outbreak stays with the local Department of Health, and they will do their investigation. Um, the CDC also gets input from a number of other organizations that also submit information, but it's a long list of different groups that will submit information, but they have to compile it all and put it together. And their job is to investigate, to research, to figure out preventative measures, but they aren't the ones that are actually going to do, say, a food recall or an alert like that. That falls to either the USDA or the FDA, depending on what product they're talking about.
It must be quite the process to nail it all down and figure out where it's come from in a hurry. I would think it would be necessary to do that, right?
Yeah, actually, it doesn't happen in a hurry. That's sort of the scary part.
Oh.
Either from the time that somebody gets sick to the time that it gets to the CDC can be weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and honestly, these investigations can go on for years because these cases keep trickling in, and they become part of this bigger investigation. And there's some cases we'll talk about, but there's nothing that happens quickly when it comes to these outbreak investigations.
So potentially the product that was the issue could be long gone and they've, got something else on their assembly line that it's not present anymore. Hypothetically.
It is very common. It's very common that by the time they figure out the source, the product's either no longer sold or it's already been consumed, not on the market, and there's nothing for them to do. And it happens all the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is kind of sad. It is good that we have something in place, regardless. I mean, the only one we know of in 323 BC was Alexander, right? Because he mattered, apparently.
Because there was a diary.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other, right? Yeah. What about everybody else? Okay, so we talked about all of that. The laboratory disease surveillance. Have we confirmed? What is there something to do with that piece involvement in this process?
Well, there are a couple things. So there's the PulseNet, which is really a national laboratory network.
Okay, gotcha.
And so they're partnering with all the laboratories to get the information, store it, categorize it. And so that's coming from all over the country, and they're sort of a clearinghouse of that information. There's also FoodNet, which is a little bit more of a surveillance group, where they are partnering with local health departments and reporting on that way, more of a surveillance aspect and less of a reporting aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are a number of others like National Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring System, Laboratory Enteric Disease Surveillance. So they're all sort of trying to get to the same place from different perspectives, really. Okay,
gotcha. And it all initially comes from a physician's report that someone has been found ill with that.
Right. And that's actually one of those barriers because they don't always report. There are different societal environmental pressures that'll keep this information from not making its way to the CDC.
Wow. Okay. So, Kirk, what about statistics? Because again, I know this isn't the only foodborne illness, and I understand that the reporting is not flawless by any stretch. But what kind of statistics do we have on foodborne illness?
Well, the CDC right now lists 250 different foodborne diseases that affect 48 million people, 128,000 are hospitalized, 3,000 die. Now, one of the things you have to remember when we look at these numbers is that these are all estimates.
Right.
Partly because we never really know how big the problem is because a lot of it doesn't get reported for different reasons. But regardless, you see that it's a huge number of people that are getting sick from these different things. In our case right now, we only are looking at a small subset of these pathogens, although they are the most common and extensive ones. There are many others that we won't even discuss.
Right. Okay. Well, we will get into some specifically. Um, so, CDC has actually identified some specific risk factors for foodborne illness. Is that correct?
Right, right. And these are really generic risk factors that affect whether it's foodborne illness or just sort of general health. But you're talking about immunocompromised individuals. You're talking about pregnancy. You're talking about
Mm,
elderly and children. And so each one has some issue related to their immunity that creates a vulnerability.
okay.
Obviously, with children, it's their undeveloped immune system. Pregnancy, they have changes in their immune system due to the pregnancy. Seniors have immune systems that aren't working as well as they might be, in addition to comorbidities and medications that they're taking for these. And then obviously, immunocompromised are just,
Yeah.
yeah,
Just at risk for everything.
forever,
So
forever.
yeah, people like you and I, it may affect us, but not as severely.
Right. And you'll see as we go through this that we talk about these deaths, and they really are occurring in these risk groups. So when we talk about, the pathogen that is the most virulent or the most fatal, they will be in those groups. Someone who's very healthy generally will survive these foodborne illnesses without much effect other than lots of vomiting and diarrhea.
Right, right. And I know vomiting comes to mind first thing for most of us when we think about this. But there are some other side effects as well, other than that. You mentioned diarrhea, of course. So those two, the most two common that we think about. But there are others, correct?
Yes, yeah. So you start with these basic um, symptoms of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea as the generic sort of general symptoms that you're going to see across all of the different pathogens, and not all of them, but it's a very good sort of tool to look at, and that's what you're dealing with. But you will get into different things where you're looking at bloody diarrhea, you're looking at high temperatures, you're looking at severe dehydration, which is going to translate into cardiac issues and fluid balance issues. And so when you start to see those things, that's when a basic sort of stomach flu gets elevated to maybe we should go to the hospital right now.
Right,
And so when you're looking at these things, that's what you start to look for to distinguish between, not so much between which pathogen made me sick, but rather what needs medical attention and what doesn't.
right. And I'm making a lot of assumptions today, aren't I, Kirk? But I was going to say, I would also assume that if you're the mother of a young child, or if you're someone who's elderly, or you have an elderly parent, that just the let's wait and see approach to feeling sick to your stomach or having diarrhea probably isn't the best approach. Would that be correct?
Right. It's true. When you're a vulnerable population, you need to take action earlier because in those cases, the progression can be much quicker. And
Right,
so waiting on something like that puts you in a bad spot where the damage and recovery is very different.
right,
So with those populations, you want to take action earlier. If you're a strong, healthy person, you can sort of wait and see what happens.
sure,
Um, but for the most part, it's for all of these, it's this fluid loss.
hmm,
And I don't care who you are, that if you're losing lots of fluid, you can run into some serious problems.
right,
And that's really initially the biggest issue that you'll run into.
right. You're losing fluid, but you can't keep any down. That's
Exactly.
never a good scenario. So we've covered the effects or who's most vulnerable, but what are some of the variables that affect food safety to begin with? I mean, we've talked about the canning piece, but there's way more involved than just canning, right?
Right, right. And you'll see that, again, these become generalized sort of concerns because they're going to affect all of these different pathogens. Although one pathogen might survive very low temperatures and one very high temperatures, the approach to safety becomes the same. So obviously, when you're looking at generalized sort of protection, you're looking at cooking temperatures, you're looking at personal hygiene. A lot of these pathogens are fecal oral routes as far as transmission, clean utensils, um, basically store how you store food outside of, say, the refrigerator or oven. Where if you leave something out for an hour or two, well, that's going to be a problem if the temperature is not right. So it's those type of things that are important. Hand hygiene, they affect all of these different pathogens, and so that's really the most important things about how you're cooking your food, how you're storing your food, how you're preparing your food, um, and then basically the health and condition of the person doing it.
Right. Perfect. Well, that explains all the employees must wash their hands signs that we see everywhere we go. And
Yeah.
so they should be. Absolutely. So that's really interesting about the different. How do we get away with sushi? This is my question. I mean, I just start thinking about all this stuff.
We don't. Um,
Ah,
it's 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 somewhat of a risk, no matter what you think about it. It's raw, and there's potentially an issue related to it. On
right,
top of it being raw, it's being stored raw and served raw, it is an increased risk.
right.
The same reason why they'll tell you if you're pregnant, you can't have sushi. If you're
Ah,
immunocompromised, you can't have sushi. So it's the same issue that there is an elevated risk. But for
right,
most people, if you get something from the sushi, you're going to be okay. But
right,
those
right.
populations, it's not a risk you want to take.
Oof. Okay, let's talk about, and again, we did talk about some of these already, but most of them actually, the generalization of main symptoms and pathophysiology. So we've covered vomiting, we've talked about diarrhea, obviously the fluid loss, temperature. Is there anything else that we need to be aware of in this category?
Well, I think one of the things we need to just recognize that it doesn't take a lot as far as fluid loss to have problems. So if you lose 10% of your body fluid, you're looking at changes in your ability to make decisions. Sort of the mental capacity starts to decrease. If you lose between 15 and 25% of your body fluid, you're looking at death. So these things can happen very quickly. And so, when I say be aware of this fluid loss, it doesn't take much to start this process sort of falling apart physically.
So there are a few things that I'm curious about in when it comes to food testing and market pressures and our current state of the economy in the world. So what about globalization and just international travel? How does that contribute to our issues with foodborne illness, or does it?
Right there, yes, it does. There are really two parts to it. The first one is sort of the traveler. So the traveler clearly can go somewhere and bring back whatever's there,
Hmm.
and that becomes something that we're dealing with here. Generally, like we've seen, most of these things don't have person to person transmission, but they can still bring that back in. The other real issue is the globalization. So we've gone from the society where uh, we eat local fruits and vegetables to society that wants to have access to everything all year. And so
Right.
now we're getting crops that we normally grow here, we're getting them imported from other countries because we want to have our strawberries in the middle of winter. And so now we have this issue of um, potential pathogens coming in from other countries that may be endemic there, but don't really exist here. And so, so that's creating those problems. We are now more interested in like exotic foods. So
Mm-hmm.
now we're reaching out to those countries that have these foods that people want to try, that they're enamored with, people that are foodies. So again, they're creating that problem. Um, on top of it, you have the issue of storage and transportation of these
Oh,
products.
yes.
Um, I read one study where it estimated that uh, less developed countries only less developed countries do not generally have refrigerated trucks. Um, the estimate was that 10 to 20% of the trucks have refrigeration. The
Wow.
ones that don't, that they're being refrigerated or cooled with ice. The ice is coming from water, local water that potentially is contaminated. And so we have this shipping issue, transportation issue that adds on top of the problem with importing foods from other nations.
Right. Interesting. So, what about? I mean, that's all really opens our eyes, and some of it I just naturally expected. Some of those things surprised me, but another issue that may or may not contribute, and you can straighten me out on this, is climate change. Does it have anything to do with this
Right.
foodborne?
Yeah. So the whole issue of climate change, everyone is the politics of it are a little difficult, but
Yeah.
um, you know, as far as climate change, it can have a tremendous impact on many different aspects of food safety.
Okay.
You start with just increase uh, rain. You're going to have more contamination with waterborne pathogens. You've got the issues with pest control. How's that going to be managed? You've got the issue
Mm.
with pollinators. We hear everyone talking about that. That has issues.
Oh, right.
You've got issues with, say, grazing and encroaching populations. So you can lose places to actually let the animals graze because of growth of populations. Um, we talk about water sources. You got issues with livestock and heat stress, weather stress. Um, and all these things are causing. They're all about cost and labor, and so you have all these different pressures that are going to affect um, how food is processed, delivered. That for the most part, we don't really know how they're going to affect it. You can see these things and you can talk about it, and they look obvious.
Uh-huh.
And I would expect these changes to occur and the problems to occur. But at the same time, no one really knows what that's actually going to be. And it creates a problem in trying to anticipate it. Now, I would anticipate what I've just talked about. Like, I think those are the things that are going to happen.
Sure.
But what really happens, it's hard to know. So trying to anticipate this and prepare for this is real problematic. Um, you have issues with potentially emerging diseases. There was a study that looked at um, ice samples from the Arctic, and they found 33 viruses in these core samples. 28 of them were unknown. Um,
Wow.
so and so you wonder what's going to happen with that. You sort of have to assume that some of that can affect the food supply and the food chain, but at the same time, we don't know. But but we know that there are things that we've never seen before, and so those things are coming to fruition. And see how they're going to affect it. Um, the other issue we have right now is surveillance. As we are involved in this sort of globalization of the food chain and food processing, we don't have a real surveillance system in place to to look at what's happening in these other places with regard to food safety.
Right.
So that's a problem, and we are trying to, or the food industry or the food safety industry here is trying to implement something like that. It's part of the where is it? Where's my note? All right. So it's part of the PulseNet, which is part of the surveillance and reporting system here in the United States. They are trying to implement the same thing across these sort of developing countries,
Okay.
so that that surveillance can be uh, on par with what we have here. But right now, there's numerous problems with that, whether it's funding or cooperation. That is still very much in its infancy, and really it's more of a proof of concept kind of situation. So that's hopefully something that's going to get developed that creates addresses some of these problems.
Right. And so I hadn't even thought about, I heard you talk about the Arctic ice cores. I just, this polar ice cap melting thing going on in my head and thought, man, what's in there? It's kind, yeah, it's it really, gives you a pause for thought for sure.
You start to think of some of these like really apocalyptic movies you see, and you sort of wonder like how close to that are we really, and you
Yeah.
start to think
Yeah.
about it like maybe.
Yeah.
Um, but whether it happens or not, it has to be part of the thinking going forward to address these potential issues.
Yeah, agriculture too, right? Just the system, agriculture is changing dramatically. Just farmland being taken over, and just see there's all kinds of new things that can happen. So you talked about the technology or the PulseNet. Is there new technology? Any other new technology surveillance that we can
Yeah.
look forward to? I can say that.
So there are a couple. There are a bunch of things going on. A lot of them
Good.
are um, very much in the sort of experimental stage, and some are further along. One of the ones that is interesting, it's actually a um, outgrowth of the COVID pandemic, is wastewater surveillance.
Oh,
Um, so, so what they were doing was that they were sampling wastewater, and in the wastewater, they can identify certain pathogens. In this case, they were using it to identify COVID.
wow.
Um, and interestingly enough, that in one situation, they were able to identify a beginning outbreak in a community 10 days before it actually showed up clinically.
Wow.
So
That's
they knew it was
fascinating.
there. Yep, they knew it was there, and it was just a matter of time before it just started showing up in the hospitals. Um, and so that process, sort of again, proof of concept was working. They showed that they now have a national wastewater surveillance system, and there's talk about trying to repurpose that for this foodborne illness surveillance. And there's research going on. It was at Oklahoma University is just doing that. They are working with wastewater there, identifying a number of different pathogens um, to sort of develop that surveillance process. So there's something very useful there, and I would think that it will be more implemented across the country as sort of there's more uptake on it.
Excellent. Wow. That's good to know. I feel somewhat reassured at this point. What about food testing?
Yeah, so there are different places they're testing food. So meaning that you can test at the processing plant, you can test when it's outside the process, and so there are a number of different things going on there. One of the big ones is CRISPR, which I think people know that's a genome process. So they're trying to use these these gene editing techniques to identify pathogens or a pathogen DNA. Um, and the belief is that these are quicker, user friendly, and applicable to many more pathogens than the current testing industry has available to them.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so like I said, there are a bunch of things. So they even have things that they're calling an electronic nose. So the idea behind this, yes. So the idea behind this is that this is in the processing plants. Um, certain pathogens give off volatile organic compounds, and so this electronic nose would identify these volatile compounds, and at that point they'd be able to identify that, oh, this pathogen's there. Um, the
Wow.
question is, like, how many of these pathogens actually give off VOCs, right?
Right.
So they know 4 right now. So it's E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, and Staph aureus. All give off these VOCs. And so that's one thing that you could use inside of the sort of the processing system. Um, there are things that are called
Brilliant.
nanoparticles. So these are similar. These are molecules that can be shaped particular to a pathogen. It's a little bit like the immune system with the lock and key or the antigen antibody situation. And so in this case, the research believe that they can actually tailor make all of these nanoparticles to identify particular pathogens.
Wow.
And so that's sort of, you know, in development. There's also things called biosensing. Um, this is similar to that, except it's actually using biological um, compounds. So this is much closer to sort of the immune system where you have that antigen antibody situation. Um, so they have targeted molecules. Then there's packaging. So now you can go further with this. You can take all
Oh,
these biosensors and the nanotechnology, put it into the packaging. Um, on top of that, you can address the issue with plastics. The plastic packaging potentially could be replaced with, um, these different types of polymers, like the organic polymers. So one of them, there were all these different names. There's ridiculously chemical names couldn't even begin to understand. But one of them came up: starch. They literally can use starch as a packaging agent. What they end up doing is creating sort of a scaffold and put this particular starch compound, can't even go into what that is. Um, but they create basically a package for that can then be embedded with these different particles as well. So you could have these antimicrobial packaging with these particular nanoparticles or biosensors on top of it. Um, this particular one with the starch, as I read it, it couldn't really be used like generic packaging like we see on whatever, but it suggested that you could spray it on like fruits and vegetables. It's edible, so you could have these packaging things with these nanoparticles or these biosensors and consume it all without having the issue of waste of plastic and
wow.
environmental. So there's
Wow.
tons of things out there. How far this goes, where it's going to net out, don't know. But it looks good as far as future goes. So let's hope that all of this sort of pans out in a positive way.
Yeah. So I'm curious, is it individual companies that are doing these testing? You said Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma is what you said, correct?
Right.
But individual like food companies would probably be wise. That would be a good competitive edge, wouldn't it, to be able to come up with something like that?
No,
Look at
it
me.
would be.
Yeah.
Right. It would
Speaking
be.
like a capitalist.
You would think, but I don't know if that's really the case. These are most of this is done sort of at university laboratory, stuff like that.
Okay.
Um, One of the big problems with the food industry or the producers of the food, these large companies, is that they don't really want anyone inside their facilities. So trying
Ah,
to get surveillance on
interesting.
site is very difficult. Um,
Sure.
by law, they have to allow people in to test stuff and things like that, and they have to show that they're doing testing. Um, but to have the type of surveillance that we really need to have, they're highly resistant to that type of um, intervention involvement.
Sure. Okay. It's got that big brother element to it, doesn't it? A little bit. Yeah.
And the other thing is they don't want to spend the money on it.
Well, yeah.
They don't see
Right.
the
Well,
value in it. They want to keep doing what they're doing without any changes.
yeah.
So
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Now, as far as tracking, and this may be silly, but social media, I know during COVID, which is obviously not a foodborne thing, but during COVID, there was a lot of, I've got it, my wife's got it, this kind of thing was going on. Is any opportunity for that to kind of help us throughout, or has it?
it's there's definitely the opportunity. It has been used. I don't know if you remember the pink slime. Um,
Yes.
right. So that there was what was it? ABC News reported on it, and then all of a sudden it blew up on the internet, and they were able to get 200,000 people to sign a petition for it. It had significant effects on food purchase, meat purchase. So there's definitely that opportunity to utilize these different platforms. Um, they lend themselves to direct communication with people, to disseminating information very quickly. It can also be targeted, and to get feedback from individuals, communities, things like that. So so it's definitely something that people are going to do. But as we've seen with all social media, like the issue with misinformation is, I don't know how you would um, keep that from
Mm,
occurring.
true.
Um, so at some point they got to figure that out in general social media stuff before this could really have a significant effect. But there's definitely a place for it. It's got potentially real time surveillance, real time data, which is one of the problems we have. Have you seen the idea that we can do an outbreak investigation, and then find the source. But by the time we find the source, the entire thing's over and there's nothing we can do. It's a huge problem. So trying to get real time data is paramount to improving these sort of protective systems and protecting people.
That pink slime scenario, that was pretty interesting stuff. There may be some people who are watching and who aren't aware of it. Anything you want to share, or ways that they can find out more about that?
So yeah, this occurred in 2012. ABC put out a news article about it. I think was it March 7th, 2012, about this particular additive. I believe it's a stabilizing additive to meat, but it created this slime, literally this pink gunk, that when you think about it, looked totally disgusting, and nobody wanted it in their meat. They just didn't want it there. Um, so it had an industry purpose, but but because it was so disgusting and it got reported on the news, it blew up on social media, and they just yeah. So, and it had a real effect on these different companies where they lost money. There were companies who went bankrupt. Um, so the effect social media had was significant. Um, so that's
Yeah, there
so
you go.
yep,
That's a
2012.
good example. It's a really good example. So, like you said, there is potential to raise awareness on social media. It's just, where do we go from there? What about this farm to fork initiative? I know there's every time I go on Netflix and there's umpteen documentaries about that, and I've watched some of them, absolutely. But thoughts on that? Good,
But you know
bad?
that no, I think it's great. It sort of harkens back to the beginning of what we were talking about with botulism at the turn of the century, where nobody wanted to adopt canning because they were used to they knew where their fruits and vegetables came from. They could see it. It was it was natural. It wasn't adulterated. It wasn't modified. And so the farm to fork initiative is that same idea, bringing the source of the food closer to where people consume it. So I personally think that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it runs it runs into the problem though. It's sort of the high populated areas, urban centers. Like, how do you do that there? Now, I think there's a way to do that because now farming is very it's very dynamic in how it's changing. Where you think about farming before, it was like big plot of land, and that's where I had to farm. Now this has become very different with hydroponics and vertical farming and things like that, where all of a sudden a side of a building can be a farm.
Yes.
So these are type of things that could be used, in sort of more densely populated areas. I think that the trick is to get buy-in from different community groups to do this, because the technology is there, the resources are there, but it takes a commitment to changing certain behaviors, and looking at environments in a different way. But definitely the sort of the farm to fork thing could be applied much broader than it is right now.
Okay. And organic. Is there a positive to organic? I mean, that's without the pesticides. So are we more vulnerable with organic? Or is it just
I,
all in the prep? Should we just, concentrate on washing the food and prepping and cooking
we
it effectively?
Right. It's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, the problem is, first of all, like, what's organic?
Right.
If it's comes from the earth, it's organic.
Yeah.
But we know we can manipulate things and and call things that I wouldn't consider organic organic.
Right.
Um, but I think in the true sense that organic foods are always going to be more beneficial to food safety in the big picture. Where we're so say we're always talking about pollinators, and we know that pesticides and chemicals are having an effect on these particular insects, and so you lose your pollinators, you lose a lot of other stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
so the organic approach helps to address that issue. I think there are ways to uh, farm where you can have different plants that support each other as far as protecting from pests.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a different way to think about it. And people don't like to because it's a little more complicated. It takes more thought than just spraying your crops with a pesticide or fungicide or whatever you want to do. Um, but it addressed the issues, and it will uh, mediate some of the problems that are going to occur with climate change. Um, so I think that although difficult to think about and maybe difficult to implement, just like farming's changed and we can have these vertical gardens, we can do the same thing with this, to create a situation where it's not as complicated as you want, as it is right now. And so I think we have to go in that direction for food safety. Otherwise, you know, the other what we're doing right now is not food safe.
Right. Right.
That's an ongoing problem, and it's just going to get worse.
I had a tour of a vertical farm. I got to tell you, that is impressive. It's fantastic. I love it. Now, last but not least, big question. What have we learned from the pandemic? What have we learned that we can transfer to our foodborne illnesses in order to try and manage those better?
Right, right. So initially, when I started thinking about that, I really wanted to come away with okay, we've learned a lot, and now we're going to apply this here. And I thought that, and then I realized what the pandemic has shown me about the food safety industry is we are not prepared. The same way
Mm-hmm.
that we weren't prepared for COVID, we don't have the infrastructure to deal with something that did come up. The surveillance isn't there. The cooperation between governments and industry is not there. Um, the ability to track's not there. It's just those same sort of big institutions, whether it's hospitals or food safety or whatever it happens to be, um, isn't making the effort to protect the sort of food chain the way it needs to be. And the horrible part is that we saw that with the COVID, that the food chain is vulnerable at
Mm-hmm.
multiple spots. And with what's changing as far as food in a global sense, those vulnerable spots are much more numerous now. And as I sit here and talk about how they are trying to set up systems um, to monitor food that's coming in from other countries to create some sort of standardized practice, um, they're nowhere near getting that done. And so, although I'm like, oh yeah, they're going there, I'm like, they're not there. And will they ever get there? I don't see it. Because it goes back to that thing like who's going to cooperate with who, and who's going to put the money in, because they can't see the immediate profit. And even though we know that saving food saves money, which you can look at as saved money as more profit, they don't look at it that way. And um, so you're running into the same problems we saw with with COVID. The issue with transparency is not there. As much as we talk about it, it's not there. The food industry doesn't want to be transparent with what they're doing. Um, so so I don't see an improvement right now. I'm not sure how we get there.
Okay, and that is the harsh reality, and it's interesting. Throughout COVID, I know one of the things that surprised me is all these little aspects of transporting food that just completely don't come into your mind. Was truckers who were transporting food across the country. They had mandatorily shut down all of the rest stops, so they couldn't use the restrooms. And you think about these tiny little things, but it affected the transportation of food, and they were really up in arms about it. It was a really just one aspect. I thought, wow, there's just so many intricate pieces when something like this happens. So
Well, to
that
that point, they've never really done that sort of gap analysis. Like,
mm,
where is it? We think about it, but no one really has systematically sit down and looked at all this and how it puts together. And it may be because it's just so complicated. Um, the article I was reading for sort of how climate change is going to affect farming and things like that, they had these crazy schematics of arrows going every different way, affecting everything else. And you look at that and you're like, that's the reality. And how do you untangle that web?
yeah, that's right. And hopefully they're actively working at untangling that web, and not waiting until the next disaster. That's the other piece that
Mhm.
a lot of us have to think about. So anything else you'd like to share with us on managing foodborne illness before we wrap up this episode, Kirk?
Well, wash your hands. I mean, it goes back to
Yeah.
those things. Right now, it's, we talk about these sort of big global issues, but the reality is right now, you got to take care of things you can take care of, and being aware of what's around you, and how to stay safe, and keep the people around you safe, and really sort of working together in that is where we should be headed. Um, and that's what I hope people get out of this. It's just a
Right.
way to keep themselves and their family safe.
Yeah. Great. Perfect. I'm going to wash my hands and have a cracker for supper. No, I'm just kidding.
Right.
No, but it's about being informed. Is that, none of this is meant to scare people, but to be informed and having knowledge. Knowledge is power. And I think it's just important, especially for nurses when we deal with patients in these, with these symptoms and these illnesses, foodborne illnesses. So thank you so much, Kirk. I can't thank you enough. I mean, your knowledge, you're definitely a big time subject matter expert. I enjoyed this conversation. And like I said, some of this I knew and some of it was a big surprise. And I know that's probably the case for a lot of our listeners. So thank you for your expertise.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for listening to our podcast series on managing foodborne illness. We encourage you to explore all of the many courses available on elitelearning.com as you move forward throughout your career. This is Leanna McGuire for Elite Learning by Colibri Healthcare.
This podcast featured content from an accredited CE activity provided by Colibri Healthcare. Visit elitelearning.com/podcasts for accreditation and disclosure statements and instructions on how you may be able to earn CE credits. Take your learning to the next level by subscribing to more podcasts on compelling healthcare topics.